What I'd like to do then is look at the beginnings of engagement with psychedelics in the modern West and in the scientific paradigm. And this, I think, is in many obvious ways, it's a very, very different story from traditional psychedelic use. And that difference is very much focused around what does psychedelics mean. Psychedelics in Western culture don't come with meanings implicit in them in the way that they do in traditional cultures. There's all kinds of things that science can do that nobody could do before in other cultures, like, for example, we can look at these substances chemically, we can synthesize them, we can look at them in terms of their biochemistry, their molecular structure, their mechanism of action on the brain, but none of this actually tells us what the psychedelic experience means. So I'd like to look at the sort of very first scientific encounters with psychedelics, partly because they're very interesting in themselves, but I also think they're very interesting because they tell us, they remind us perhaps of some fundamental points about the ways that psychedelics first struck us in modern culture. And I'm going to take the beginning of this story as to be the discovery of nitrous oxide, which happened in 1799 in a laboratory there. And that's the beginning for me, because it was the first mind-altering psychedelic substance, or dissociative psychedelic, that had been kind of synthesized in a laboratory rather than found in nature. And also, as soon as its properties were recognized, it immediately led into this amazing program of research, which was a whole bunch of people for the first time ever sitting down saying, here's a substance that dramatically affects our consciousness, let's take it and let's see what it does, let's try and describe it, let's try and figure out what was going on. So nitrous oxide was first synthesized by Humphrey Davy, who was going to go on to become Sir Humphrey Davy and the president of the Royal Society and the inventor of the Davy lamp and all that. But at this point, he was a young chemist. This was his first job as a laboratory assistant. The laboratory he was working in was a sort of laboratory specializing in gases called the Pneumatic Institution, which had been set up by a radical doctor called Thomas Beddoes. So this was probably the first example of what we would now call a medical research institution, in the sense that this is somewhere that was deliberately set up to synthesize new chemicals, then to try them out and see if they could work in sort of medicine and therapy. So this is all happening within that kind of medical experimental context. But as soon as Davy and Beddoes inhaled nitrous oxide, they realized that, yeah, it probably had therapeutic potential, but it also had some other extremely interesting properties of altering the mind and heightening consciousness. So what they noticed straight away was that it seemed to have this ability to produce pleasure or euphoria when you inhaled it, just a kind of big wave of euphoria that didn't seem to be about anything else except the gas. So that in itself raised all kinds of interesting questions. How come this substance that didn't even exist in nature can suddenly be produced and can just push human pleasure buttons just like that? What's going on? But it was more than pleasure. It also stimulated the kind of higher reaches of the imagination, and it produced for them these really kind of cosmic revelatory sensations, you know, as the effect of the gas peaked. And then it kind of diminished, leaving them not quite sure, you know, what it had actually been. But they had, so this kind of went far beyond medicine into really philosophy and big questions about what is the human condition, what is the relation between our material chemical makeup and our sort of, visionary experience. And they had an amazing group of researchers to try this out on, because their sort of social circle that they hung out with included, for example, young romantic poets Robert Southey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So everybody went at it, inhaling nitrous oxide. It was in the evening after the laboratory work was done. Davy would just set up this reaction, heating ammonium nitrate and producing nitrous oxide, and all these people would come around and inhale it. And he set up a loose experimental kind of protocol where people who'd had the gas would then have to write a little account, a little description of what had happened to them. And what's so interesting about this for me is that at this point we didn't have the kind of two cultures divide that we have now between art and science. So these are doctors and chemists and poets and philosophers all coming together, and the assumption that they're all working from is that this, David's question, what do psychedelics mean? This is a question that, needs all these different disciplines to answer it. So, the first person to inhale the gas and write a report on it was Robert Southey, who would later become a poet laureate. His description of his nitrous oxide experience was, the atmosphere of the highest of all possible heavens must be composed of this gas, which is not bad for your first nitrous oxide airbag. And it's also a good indication of where they were going with this, because he's saying, it's using religious language, but at the same time it's subverting religious language. Because this is a culture that was, with a very strong religious orthodoxy. The idea out there was that any kind of religious revelation had to come from the church, had to come from revealed religion and the scriptures. So he's saying, now, heaven now has an atmosphere, and we can synthesize it in our laboratory, so we don't need to go through the church anymore. The atmosphere of heaven is right here. We've seized control of the means of production of religious experience. And at the same time, he's also kind of, it's very lyrical. He's not trying to describe this in sort of rationalist, materialist terms. Because on the one hand, they're trying to avoid this kind of, religious language. But on the other hand, they realize that, rationalist, sort of reductive, materialist language is not going to, produce the answers that they want. So they're kind of trying to steer somewhere in the middle. Humphrey Davy talks very early on about a language of feeling. What we need is a new language of feeling. We need a new language because these are new states of consciousness that nobody has ever experienced before. And the language of feeling at the same time was very much what the Romantic poets were trying to do. They were trying to produce a new language that could describe moods and emotions and sensations and perceptions that nobody had ever talked about before. So as the nitrous oxide experiments went on, Davy started taking more and more heroic doses because he always wanted to know what would happen if you took more, right? And this climaxed with a sort of famous final experiment, which was on Boxing Day, 1799, when Davy stripped to the waist, put a thermometer under his arm, got into this box that he'd had specially made, which was airtight, and then pumped nitrous oxide into it for an hour and a quarter until he felt that he was totally saturated with it. And then he came out and inhaled 20 quarts of nitrous oxide, one after the other. And at this level, he went to a place that he'd never been before, a place, in fact, that nobody had ever been before. He went beyond his body. He went into what he calls a realm of ideas, where he just had no physical extension at all. He went beyond space and time, because this was a sort of infinite space that he was in, and it was like a timeless, frozen moment, and sort of everything that was in the universe was there, and he was just like master of the universe and could make any kind of connections that he wanted to. And then when he came back from this, he had to try and, sum this up. And he kind of came up with this, what became a very famous sentence. He said, "Nothing exists but thoughts. The world is composed of impressions, ideas, pleasures, and pains." So that was maybe the first answer to this question of what do psychedelics mean. That actually, one of the interesting things was that as well as just having discovered this dissociative psychedelic, they'd also just got introduced to German idealist philosophy, Kant and so on, so they were also playing with these ideas that actually the reason, reality out there is not like a fixed thing out there. It only looks that way to us because that's the way our brains are wired, because we have mental categories of sort of space and time and so on that order reality. But in fact, that's because of our senses and the way they work. If you change the inputs with a substance like nitrous oxide, you change the sort of sensory input that you're getting, then actually what you get is a whole different reality. So that's kind of the revelation that really came out of the first engagement with psychedelics, was that it's not our inner world in here and the real world out there, that these two are actually going to bleed into each other much more. And in fact, our inner world, our imagination, creates reality much more than people realize. And this, of course, was also, a central insight of the Romantic movement that people like Coleridge would go on and develop. So when Davy wrote up his nitrous oxide researches, he wrote them up in a report entitled Researches Chemical and Philosophical. And the first section of this is the chemical synthesis, how he produced nitrous oxide. And the last section is all the subjective reports of everybody he gave it to. which I think is kind of fascinating because from the beginning you can see the idea to answer the question, what does psychedelics mean? It involves two mutually unintelligible languages, chemical synthesis on the one hand and subjective reportage on the other. And, some of you are probably ahead of me here, but if you fast forward 200 years and look at the Shulgin's work, for example, it's very interesting to see that they report in exactly the same form that Davy did, the chemical synthesis and then the subjective extension. So Davy went on to become probably the, most famous British scientist of his generation, and his legend was founded on the nitrous oxide experiment. So this was all the way through the 19th century. There was this idea that this is what great scientists did. They kind of put themselves out there and they kind of experimented fearlessly on themselves. So actually, throughout the 19th century, it's pretty standard for people who are sort of starting to work with mind-altering drugs that they should take them themselves. That's kind of the first thing that they assume that's the most obvious way to proceed. So, just to take one example, the French psychiatrist Jean-Jacques Moreau de Tours. Moreau was the first person to write about the effects of cannabis or hashish. Cannabis is not a psychedelic, you may say. Moreau's idea of a dose was about 3 or 4 grams taken orally. The whole point of this was to produce like a really, really intense delirium that would go on for hours and hours and hours. And in Moreau's writing about hashish, he's really explicit about this. He says many, many times, I challenge the right of anyone to discuss the effects of hashish if he's not speaking for himself. In other words, what do psychedelics mean? Well, you have to take them to figure out what they mean. And that's very interesting, I think, because that's not the way that science operates these days. But that is kind of what everybody who was trying to sort of figure out what these drugs were doing did for a long, long time until recent times. So I just want to conclude by looking at the end of the 19th century and the emergence of what we would now call the first major psychedelic, mescaline, originally in the form of the peyote cactus, which mescaline was synthesized from in 1897. And this was discovered kind of gradually through the 1890s by a whole bunch of scientists coming at it from very different angles, but always from personal experience and personal experimentation. And what's fascinating to me about this is by the 1890s, the anti-drugs movement was in pretty full swing. All the forces that were going to lead to prohibition were going, there were big tabloid campaigns about the evil of drugs, but drugs then kind of meant opium and morphine and cocaine. Psychedelics kind of weren't thought of as drugs at that time in the same way. They were thought of more as we'd now say, research chemicals. So the discovery of mescaline started with the sort of first written account of a peyote experiment, which was by James Mooney, who was an ethnographer at the Smithsonian Institution. He was spending a lot of time with the Sioux people, and he did a lot of peyote rituals with them. And his write-up of it was, of the peyote experience, was incredibly positive, The Indians, he said, regard the mescal, that's kind of what peyote was known at the time, as a panacea in medicine, a source of inspiration, and the key which opens to them all the glories of another world. So he immediately got, what Paul was talking about in terms of the traditional use. Although he also said, but it's not quite going to be that way for us. This is because it's part of Sioux culture. It comes with all kinds of meanings. We're going to have to discover our own meanings for this. We're going to have to discover our own uses. Mooney's work was then picked up by a couple of physiologists called Prentice and Morgan, who gave peyote to lots and lots of experimental subjects and studied them. And they were kind of interested in it from a physiological point of view, like it's a stimulant, for example. It keeps people awake all night. That was kind of interesting. They were also interested in the visionary qualities. But straight away what they found was that it was very hard to describe what these substances were doing, because you got such different responses from different people. The first person they gave it to, the first volunteer, had a kind of euphoric, blissful experience. The second person had a really nightmarish experience. And it's interesting to look at this because it reminds us of just how strange psychedelics are in these kind of terms. Most drugs kind of do the same thing to everybody. An antibiotic is an antibiotic. Even most mind-altering drugs. Valium is not like a stimulant for some people and a sedative for other people, right? It's that cannabis and psychedelics have this peculiar quality of producing very different responses in different people. And that's kind of a problem for scientific methodology from the beginning, because science wants things that are kind of measurable and repeatable and predictable. So Prentice and Morgan's work was then picked up by probably the most distinguished psychiatrist in America at that time, a guy called Silas Weir Mitchell, who specialized in kind of nervous disorders and nervous breakdowns. And he was, I think, probably interested in the possibility that it might work as a kind of cure for nervous conditions. But he decided that it wouldn't because it was such kind of, such a physical ordeal. It was so physically draining. It was kind of not the thing that he thought was kind of good to give to people with very delicate nervous conditions. But nevertheless, he had an amazing time with it, which he wrote up in all the medical journals of the day. And he said, to be able with a whole mind to experiment mentally upon such phenomena is an unusual privilege. So whether it's got any therapeutic applications or not, he was saying, if you're sane, if you're healthy, this is still an amazing thing to do. Mitchell's work was published in the British Medical Journal, apart from anywhere else, and where it was read in Britain by Havelock Ellis, a psychologist and art critic, who became the first person to take peyote in Britain in his rooms in London in the Temple in 1895. And he writes an amazing description of his peyote experience, which is almost like a kind of art review. He takes it on a totally aesthetic level, just trying to describe, the colours and the visual effects and the patterns that he's seeing, comparing them to everything from, Maori wood carving to sort of Persian. At the end of it, he says, if it should ever chance that the consumption of mezcal becomes a habit, the favourite poet of the mezcal drinker will certainly be Wordsworth. Many of his most memorable poems and phrases cannot, one is almost tempted to say, be appreciated in their full significance by one who's never been under the influence of mezcal. So this is this takes us back very nicely to the discovery of nitrous oxide and the sort of beginning of the Romantic poets, because what Ellis is talking about here with Wordsworth, I think, is Wordsworth's kind of sense that it's not kind of, we're not separated from nature. It's not kind of, the sort of humanity inside our heads and nature out there. It's humanity and nature interpenetrating each other and, in a sense, kind of creating each other. So all the while these experiments were going on, people were still trying to figure out what it actually was in the peyote that was doing this, looking for the psychoactive chemical ingredient, and there were various people doing this. It turned out to be quite hard because there's all kinds of different kind of organic extracts that you can get out of peyote depending on what you do. Most of them aren't psychoactive. Some doctors were kind of giving the different ones to dogs and seeing if they could figure out which dogs were tripping. But the guy who won the race was Arthur Hefter in Leipzig, and he just took the samples himself, and he, won the race to identify mescaline. So by that time, as we can see, a lot of people have been taking psychedelics and looking at them from a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different frameworks. You may have noticed one framework that's kind of not really sort of explicitly there, which is surprising perhaps, is the spiritual framework. I think that's partly because these people were mostly looking at it with different scientific agendas in mind. But I think also it's because, we tend to lose sight of the fact that, the effect of psychedelics, this is a scientific claim, the fact that they produce higher states of consciousness. And even if those higher states of consciousness are spiritual or religious, what you're fundamentally saying is, hey, you can take a chemical, and do this. So there is a kind of, underlying scientific basis to everything that's going on here. But the person who first figured out how to get a spiritual, how to frame the spiritual experience in this was William James, the great psychologist and philosopher who'd been observing all this very, very closely. James was a scientist, but he believed that science had a problem because it privileged certain types of phenomena over other ones. It tended to privilege ones that were easily sort of observable and measurable. And for that reason, it didn't really kind of take seriously the claims of subjective experiences and mystical states. And for James, this was a failing in science. Science needed to figure out a way of kind of understanding these things and sort of bringing them into the purview of science. So he tried to take peyote, but found he couldn't kind of stomach it, went for nitrous oxide instead. And he had an amazing revelation on nitrous oxide, which he writes about mostly in terms of the philosophy of Hegel. Weirdly enough, he is also kind of tangling with German idealistic philosophers at the same time as he's discovering his dissociative psychedelics. A very potent combination. So what he can't grasp with Hegel is how it can be true or possible that two opposite propositions can be true at the same time. As soon as he takes nitrous oxide. such a revelation for James, because although he was a scientist, his father was a Swedenborgian mystic who'd had very powerful religious experiences, and James had never had them, and he'd always felt he was missing of reality and human experience that wasn't open to him, and nitrous oxide gave it to him. And the central revelation for him he expresses it in very famous terms when he writes The Varieties of Religious Experience. So this is what he says he's learned from nitrous oxide, is that our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. In other words, whatever appears in these visionary states and in these spiritual states, whether it sort of turns out to be literally true or not, the experience itself is psychologically real. And just the fact that the experience itself is psychologically real tells us that there are other ways of seeing the world and there are other ways of being in the world. And whatever else psychedelics mean, that's where their meaning starts. Thank you.